Hello, welcome to Bloke on the Range, and I'm very happy to have Dale back on the channel, and we're going to talk about a little bit of Swiss Cold War history that's kind of obscure but kind of cool. Atombrot. Take us through it.
Everyone, nice to meet you again. Today we have a bit of miscellanea to cover. So while doing our research for the Sturmgewehr 57 and its rifle grenades, which we covered, I think, pretty well on this channel so far, pretty extensively.
It's an understatement.
Yeah, pretty much. When talking to former militiamen, they mentioned some mysterious food item that they have consumed during their basic training and refresher courses called Atombrot, or nuclear bread, radioactive bread.
Atomic bread.
Atomic bread. What is that? So I dug a little bit in public archives. This is not in-depth stuff. And I found quite a lot of information out there, and I found it really, really interesting. So this is really the topic of today's video. We're going to talk about bread in the Swiss Army in general as kind of a one-on-one context, bread substitutes, which this one kind of is, as well as the method of production, its patented secret sauce, which gives it its shelf life of 2 years, pretty impressive, and recipes, usage, and some user feedback, just to give you an idea of how well this bread was received. Now let's kick this right off. Now, Swiss Army Bread 101. After the Second World War, there was a major standardization of bread solutions because what they realized during the Second World War is that there were too many different varieties, too many different production methods. And so in order to rationalize all this with the lessons learned during the Aktivdienst, which is the mobilization period in the Second World War, they standardized the bread recipes into 3 main categories. The default preferred bread for troop resupply in general was brown bread, or in French, pain bis, in German, Hochbrot. Basically.
Rough bread.
Rough bread, yeah. So for those of you who are not really familiar with bread terms, this uses brown flour, which in the Swiss definition is 82% extraction in terms of wheat. So it's kind of in the middle between white flour and whole wheat. The idea behind this, there are 2 reasons why they chose this type of flour. One, it's cheaper. Since you waste less of the grain to make the same quantity of flour, it is more economical to make a large amount of bread. And second is for nutritional reasons, especially in terms of vitamin B1 and this kind of thing, and also for good old-fashioned roughage. Such a flour is more advantageous for just troop day-to-day usage. Now, the Swiss Army did put a little spin on it. The general commercial loaf that is sold in regular bakeries is just round 1 kilogram loaf, pretty standard. But the Swiss Army added its little twist around 1954, 1955 with the introduction of the standardized Feldbrot, or field bread. Now, what is special about the Swiss Army bread is that it's baked in a mold. Now, they did a lot of studies on the shape of the crust, and they found that a rectangular cross-section resulted in less evaporation, which meant that the bread could stay fresh for much longer. So pretty clever. And they also bake these for slightly longer in order to get a thicker crust, to improve handling, and to avoid bread damage during transportation, because one of the problems with bread is really its fragility. And also a little bit of secret sauce, which I haven't been quite able to put my finger on. They put chemical preservatives, they call them Hilfsmittel, it's a little bit of a mysterious term, in order to inhibit the growth of yeasts and molds which might spoil the bread on the long run. Now, kind of as a fresh bread substitute, sourdough bread was also deemed fit for military service. Now, sourdough bread is basically, instead of using yeast that you add to the bread artificially, you use the yeasts that are naturally present within the load of the original flour, as well as using lactic acid bacteria to achieve the same rising effect. The bread was considered good in terms of nutritional qualities. However, it wasn't deemed a perfect substitute because of the digestive issues it could give you due to the high lactic acid content, as well as the fact that it wasn't very versatile because of its taste. But in case there is a yeast shortage, which could happen, upon special order, you could make the mother of the sourdough starter or sourdough culture. That could be done pretty easily on the small unit bakery level. Now, we talked a lot about fresh bread, which spoils, it goes rancid. It is fundamentally incompatible with the ideals of modern warfare. Being able to decentralize, being able to be self-sufficient, being able to store bread for long purposes. And therefore, the Swiss Army did recognize this with bread substitutes. Now, the historical one is the famous Zwieback, which is biscuit, basically like a rusk.
Melba toast.
Yeah, yeah, more or less.
Dried.
Basically, a very highly cooked, dehydrated bread, which was very affectionately called the Bundesziegel, or the federal brick, because of its tough texture. It was replaced in 1954 with the legendary Cambly military biscuit. What's interesting about the history of this biscuit is that they drew inspiration from the commercial Le Petit Beurre, which is a small shortbread, essentially speaking. What they did is that they put a little twist to it. Instead of regular butter, which is considered too luxurious and may add rancidity, they replaced it with vegetable shortening, and they added stuff like milk powder and replaced it with brown flour for increased nutritional value. And so this biscuit is actually still in production today, and I think the recipe did not fundamentally change. But the problem with both of these bread substitutes is that even though from a caloric aspect they are quite nice, the issue is they don't give you the same feeling of fullness when you eat them, not to mention, stuff like constipation issues when you eat too many of them. It doesn't do a very good number on your digestive system. And so the Swiss Army was kind of in a pickle. We have these imperfect bread substitutes, or we have this imperfect fresh bread. What is the middle ground? So they had a problem to solve, and this is where our little Atombrot comes in. Now, the Atombrot was officially mentioned in army documents, I think as early as around 1963. There's really nothing very special about this bread from a pure ingredient perspective. If you study the ingredients list, it's essentially the same brown bread, but it has some extra ethanol in there, or alcohol. We're going to take a look later how they actually incorporate it into the bread, and I find this pretty interesting. Now, these come in relatively small loaves, about 350 grams. I think if we gave an estimation, it's about this big. And each loaf was 830 calories, basically a one-day ration, essentially speaking. These are packed in crates of 40. And there was also a sweet version called the Früchtenbrot, or fruit bread. The same recipe, except that they added whole wheat flour and preserved dried fruits and nuts in order to make it more palatable. This was definitely the more popular of the two breads. Now, both of these breads were introduced simultaneously around the 70s, but in order to understand exactly why it's there and how it's there, we need to first study on whose idea it was in the first place to add alcohol or ethanol in standard fresh bread. This right here is the star of the show. This is Mr. Walter Kuchen, which...
Perfect. That is nominative determinism. Absolutely perfect name for...
His career was pretty much decided the moment he came out of the womb. But basically, for those who don't speak German, Kuchen means cake. So this dude is named Mr. Cake, and he's the professional army baker. He had an incredibly interesting life, and his work on the influence of the Swiss Army's provision and bread policies cannot be understated. His work was tremendous. Now, just to give you a very quick recap of this man's life, he was born in 1932 in Belp. He was the son of a professional baker. So obviously he took on the trade and started to work for the army as a bread inspector and an army master baker, as they call it at the time. But there was a major turning point in his career that you could argue that probably affected a lot of the development of this Atombrot. In 1958, he developed a hypersensitivity or allergy to wheat, which for a baker is obviously absolutely catastrophic. And now this did not put him down. He did not abandon his passion for bread. Even though he could not make bread anymore, he could still continue his passion. So what he did is that he converted himself from making the bread to training people how to make the bread. And that was extremely important. So what he did is that he rose up to the ranks as a warrant officer, or Adjutant Unteroffizier in German, and he worked for the OKK as a supply troop instructor. Now, the OKK, or Oberkriegskommissariat, basically the High Commissionary of War. It's a bit of a nebulous term, but they're basically the organization in terms of the administrative organization for the resupply of the Swiss Army. So they take care of fuels, lubricants, and food, and water, of course, the very important pillars. And therefore he worked there as a trainer, essentially speaking. He trained, I think, over tens of thousands of bakers over his career, really an incredible person. Now, he was, of course, acutely aware of the problems of the army concerning preserved bread and how to increase the shelf life of bread without significantly detracting from its organoleptic qualities. And therefore, he started work on this new process, and this eventually culminated into a patent which he filed on December 1961 called On the Preservation of Bread Products. And in the patent he describes, which we'll take a look later, basically immersing the bread in an alcoholic solution and to vacuum seal it to preserve all this moisture, this disinfecting solution, so to speak, with the bread, and thus increasing its shelf life significantly. Now, as soon as the patent was published, the army was extremely interested. And what's incredible is the back and forth, the exchanges between Walter Kuchen and the senior staff at the OKK, because of course there's the problem of how do you license this? This is a very deep rabbit hole on who gets compensated and how much over what period of time. And so these negotiations really took quite a significant amount of time. And eventually in 1965, an agreement was reached. From what I understood, Kuchen was compensated on a lump sum payment instead of on a per bread basis, simply because the army could not really estimate how many breads they could produce. I think it was upwards of, roughly 100,000 Swiss francs, which for 1960 is a pretty decent amount of money. So Kuchen was generously compensated for his work. Now, just because the license agreement was signed does not mean that the bread goes into production. There were some pretty serious teething issues with the bread, notably in terms of vacuum sealing technology. The plastics material and the understanding of vacuum sealing in general was a little bit primitive at the time, so sourcing the right equipment for the right capacity was very difficult, and so this took quite a lot of time. Another problem are the hygiene requirements behind this bread. It required very highly trained personnel, and therefore took a lot of time to make sure that the production line was set in place, etc., etc. And therefore, mass introduction of the bread would only happen around 1977, which followed basically the major 1973 resupply reform, which was a major turning point in Army logistics. Honestly, I think it's worth its own video, but just to make a long story short, it took over 10 years to really nail down the process for mass introduction. Now, meanwhile, Kuchen has been kept busy. He also introduced a mobile flour mill, which is an improvement of the model 1955 model, which allowed, it basically is a trailer that you could cart around, just dump the raw wheat in there, and out comes whole flour, basically. So it's a great innovation to decentralize all this. Now, as the bread was introduced in 1984, another very critical event, it was deemed a mandatory consumption item, or Pflichtkonsum. The basic concept behind this really is just to increase the turnover in the shelves. Since the bread only had a shelf life of 2 years, only, when you think about it in the scale of an army and all the policies, it's really a quite short period. And so the bread has to be consumed after a while, and to encourage this rotation, to liquidate old stock, it was deemed as a mandatory consumption item. We're going to take a look later at the exact quotas and numbers. In 1990, Kuchen retires. He has served a very long life for the Swiss Army, and so what he does is that he converts himself to charity work with the Licht im Osten project. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the economic situation of the ex-USSR countries was not great. So what he did is I believe that he took ex-army mobile bakeries, again trailers that allowed the production of bread, to Ukraine, and train local bakers on how to use them to provide fresh bread to the population despite the relatively tough conditions. So really some incredible work. And finally, in 2017, sadly, he passes away at the ripe age of 85 years old. And so his work was really quite significant for the Swiss Army in general. I would have loved to talk to him and see what incredible knowledge that he has, but unfortunately they went away when he passed. So let's focus a little bit more on the patented secret sauce. This is based off of his patent documents. it's really quite simple. The bread is very ordinary, and what you do is you mix sterile, purified water, which is very important to avoid a low microbiological load at the beginning, and then to this you add 10 to 20% in terms of volume of fine spirits, which would be today considered food-grade ethanol. And so this gives you a disinfecting solution, a pretty weak disinfecting solution, and then you would saturate the bread and then vacuum seal. It's really quite simple. Now there's a couple of articles I would love to read about this. Apparently there's this old scientific repository of issues dealing with bread, and apparently Kuchen worked with the Zurich University on exactly the microbiological load of these breads as time went on, depending on the concentration, depending on the quality of the water. And what I understood is that above a certain concentration, and the sweet spot was 16.66 apparently, it's very specific, but it basically killed off most of the spores and the bacteria as well that could result in spoilage. But if you exceeded a certain amount of alcohol, this resulted in some pretty poor taste characteristics. Apparently the bread tasted too much of alcohol. So there was a fine balance to be struck, and that's what I found pretty interesting about this. Now let's talk a little bit about the production process. Having worked a little bit in the food industry, this was something that I found absolutely fascinating. Now, the Atombrot was not something that you could easily improvise in the field. It was kind of this compromise between decentralization and centralization, in the sense that any commercial bakery that it's worth its salt could be converted to Frischhaltebrot production or Atombrot production, but at the same time, given the sophistication of the equipment, you still need to, be economical and to make sure to consolidate it to make it reasonable. Now, you can see right here, it's really quite straightforward. From the raw material, you have the kneading machines, and then there's the dividing, the shaping, and here, I'm going to show you pictures of it later, a fully automatic proofing setup, which is absolutely incredible. It's all a continuous process. They really try to remove as much of the batch process as possible to optimize all this. And then, of course, there's your sheeter and shaper. And of course, the breads are inserted into molds, which are slightly smaller than the standard army bread molds, since they're only 350 grams. And all of this is stuck onto a conveyor oven. Again, continuous process. You want to churn these out as fast as possible. Now, all this is pretty standard, but really the magic happens in the so-called high hygiene zone. There's a distinct separation, and you can see that they really applied modern HACCP, OPRP, all of these modern management principles in this particular process. And of course, you have the mixing of the alcoholic disinfecting solution and kind of a black box here. To be honest, I'm not really quite sure how they put the alcohol in just yet. I have a few details which I'll share later on. But apparently they somehow inject the alcohol into the bread. And then there's a very advanced vacuum sealing machine that we're going to take a look later. And finally, we have the packaging. Oh, and there's also something very important that I forgot to mention. The intermediate step between the bread making and the bread disinfection, there's a very long cooling process, which is extremely important. I think they cool these for like 16 hours in a climate-controlled environment. Very important to stabilize the bread to prepare it for disinfection. I'm just going to show you a couple of really incredible pictures. These were digitized by the VBS Mediatek. And I would love to have the whole deck, the whole album digitized. This is unfortunately just a partial view, but it should give us a pretty good idea. Now you can see here the kneading machines, which are high volume. They're basically put on push carts, so you can simply remove it once you're done, and then just put it in the big dough divider right here, which simply portions it into 350 gram segments. Right here is a really cool conical pre-shaper. Now what this does is that you basically have a conical drum that just rotates constantly, and you have a helical kind of guide path, which is a U shape. And so that once the dough drops down, it is basically being spun around until it eventually becomes a neat little ball shape, and that's when it drops into the fully automatic proofing cupboard. Now, this thing is absolutely crazy. You can see right here, once the dough finishes, it drops into this little port right here, and there's probably some sort of conveyor system that moves them progressively up. Now, I'm not sure how long the proofing time is, but I suppose that once it is done, it comes out of these little holes and then drops back down onto the actual shaping apparatus. Absolutely crazy stuff. really the peak of modern bread production. Now you can see the chute that I just mentioned and a perfectly proofed and pre-shaped ball of dough. And right here is a dough sheeter. That's what they use to make, for example, croissants or any sort of kind of application where you need a flat sheet of dough. So the dough is first flattened, and here is your actual rolling apparatus. Now you can see here there's basically, it's probably wool felt, because wool felt is pretty standard in bakery production. What it does is that it catches on the top of the now flattened piece of dough, and because of the conveyor that is moving, it just allows it to roll and turns it into kind of a long baguette shape. Now once this baguette shape is achieved, they are dropped into the little molds that are greased, I believe, with vegetable shortening, if I'm not mistaken. So once the shaped dough is put into the molds, they are allowed to proof again to fill the mold cavity, and then they're baked. Now what I find interesting about this picture is that even though the flow chart mentions a conveyor oven, here you can see that they use a pretty standard professional bakery oven. So you can understand that, of course, what matters is the result. How you achieve this result depends on what equipment is available and what kind of skill is available. Now after this, obviously you have to demold the bread, which is then stored in these wooden baskets to be cooled over this long period, as I mentioned before. Now here you can see, this is a picture from a different album. Here you can see that they're demolding fruit bread. So you can see that they're made kind of simultaneously on the same line, which is kind of problematic when you think about it, because the fruit bread contains nuts. So I'm actually not sure how they managed food allergies in the army, or if that was even an issue back then. But
I think people didn't worry about it so much back then. It wasn't such a big deal.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, I don't really see how they could hose down the entire line just for fruit bread production. It seems absolutely impractical to me. So I guess they just didn't worry about it.
Or they didn't allow people with nut allergies into the service.
That's a good point as well. So that kind of is a question mark there. So if any of you participated in this production process, or if you're trained in the Boltigen Bakery School, let us know, because I'm very curious to know how they managed all this. Now here's the special sauce production, and basically here this bakery soldier is weighing out the alcoholic disinfecting solution. You can see that it's a very well-controlled process with the forms and the log cards here to ensure traceability. So I'm sure they had some sort of barcode or lock code system minimum in order to make sure that the 2-year shelf life is guaranteed for every single bread that leaves this facility. And in case anything goes wrong down the line, make sure to correct this for future applications. So it really shows how much work is being put in such a simple food item to make sure that you have a consistent, safe product. It's really not that easy. Now here is the star of the show here. This is the fully, or I would say semi-automatic bread vacuum sealing machine. I think the output on this is 1,500 breads per hour, which is not too shabby. When you think about it, over an 8-hour work period, you made a bit more than 10,000 breads. It's not too bad, I gotta say. And I'm not really quite sure how it works, but the way I understand it is that there are probably 2 parts to this. You have the lid and you have the body. And based on what I see in this picture here, this is probably the top of the machine, or the bottom. I suppose that's the bottom. The breads which have been injected in the solution, I think they use a kind of a needle injection system. There's 62 needles that just plunge into the breads and inject them in solution. Kind
of like water injected meat.
I think they would use probably the same equipment, actually.
Yeah. So, little aside, I always forget what water injected meat is like, because it's not allowed in Switzerland. All meat is meat. And then when I'm in other European countries or wherever, and I like try and cook bacon, and it just goes bleh. With all the water comes out of it. It's nasty.
Really nasty, yeah. But well, let's say that here the water is somewhat desirable, at least from the producer's perspective. So yeah, I have no idea how they do it. I don't have any pictures of the injection setup.
I think booze injected bread is always going to be superior to water injected meat.
I would tend to agree with that statement, yeah. But in this case, you can see they're just placing the breads manually onto, I suppose, is the body component of the packaging. And then there's probably, the machine is slid onto this carriage assembly, and then the film is unrolled, and then everything just closes and then welds together. And of course, you have the vacuum that is drawing it out. And here you can see really wonderful picture, excellent color, really incredible digitalization work, excuse me. You can see one dude who has the mind-numbing work of inspecting each and every single one of these breads. You can see on his expression how happy he is to be here and to serve his country. But yeah, you can clearly see on the back the breads that are lined up, and I suppose that right now he's in a sealing cycle, I guess, judging by the pressure gauge right here. So really quite a sophisticated setup. And all of this is plopped onto a conveyor. You have an alternative angle here, very long conveyor. And at the end, of course, you have a couple of dudes that would pick up the final packaged bread and stick them inside of the boxes. So really an incredible process. I would have loved to see this in person, in the flesh, but unfortunately that's no longer possible. Okay, so we talked very briefly about how it's made, what's it made of, but how is it used? The official manual of arms to consume this bread was to unpack 1 hour before consumption, and 1 hour minimum. I've heard that it's even preferable to leave it out for at least 3 to 4 hours, apparently. Now, the idea behind this is pretty obvious. You want the alcohol and the water to somewhat dissipate. Otherwise, you're going to get boozy, soggy bread, which understandably is not very desirable. So yeah, once you unpacked it and let the vapors dissipate for a little bit, you can consume it with very thin slices. I think the recommendation was 5mm slices, which is basically the thickness of a coin. And you have to consume all this once unpacked within 6 to 8 hours. Now, back to the topic of mandatory consumption to increase turnover. Now, this policy was introduced in January of 1984. The idea was to basically obligate quartermasters and fourriers, as they were called in the Swiss army, to order a set quantity of bread to be fed to the men every single period of time. Now you can see, for example, the quotas for the various refresher course lengths, and of course the quotas for basic training. So that means, indirectly speaking, that anybody who served after 1984 had to have a taste of this wonderful, soggy, boozy bread. And mostly the people that you interview that had a taste of this wonderful delicacy are people that served roughly in this area, basically the last volley of troops before Army 95. That was kind of the generation that experienced this type of bread. Now, one little thing, in 1986, the mandatory consumption quotas were reduced, apparently because there was a demand-supply imbalance. The supply couldn't keep up with the demand. I don't know if it's because the bread was so popular that people were ordering this proactively, or because they were overshooting their mandatory quotas, or they used them as ballast to feed, let's just say, lower-ranking troops. I think that was one of the issues that was noted in the leaflet in 1986, was that mandatory consumption items tended to be dumped to the troops, basically, with no real coherence in the menus. And you could argue that maybe that's where the bad reception of the bread comes from, but that's something that I don't really know. Now, what's also pretty funny is in the magazine Der Fourier, which really describes a lot of this in vivid detail, is the versatility of this fresh preserved bread, and it gives many examples and ideas of how to creatively manipulate this bread into different recipes. Apparently, and this I find a little bit disgusting, you could slice the bread pretty thin and use this kind of as aperitif bases, which is a little bit unusual. I guess you can have your alcohol with the food at the same time, which is pretty convenient. Another one is to do a Käseschnitten or croûte au fromage, cheese crostini, basically a open-faced cheese toasty or grilled
Welsh
cheese.
rare bit, but Swiss.
Exactly, yeah, that's pretty accurate. The fruit bread, which was vastly more popular, could be used as a dessert, or you could do a classic Brotsuppe, which sounds super exciting, bread soup. And then, of course, French toast or toast with mushroom sauce. So yeah, you can get pretty creative in order to kind of get past your mandatory quotas. There are many ways on how you can substitute regular bread for these. Now, of course, you can also consume it neat, so to speak, in breakfast or in the field where fresh bread is in short supply. It's definitely a little bit better than field biscuits. Now, in terms of actual consumer feedback, I asked around. I asked a couple of ex-militiamen, and I have to say the overall consensus is the bread was not really appreciated by the troops. A couple of examples here. A little smell of Chernobyl. People complained that once they opened it, they basically fainted because of the strong smell of alcohol. One said, we rinsed the bread in the lake and then we actually hung them out to dry on a clothesline, which is pretty funny on its own. Some even use this as fire starter because of their ethanol content. It's pretty funny. And the last one, even better, they actually give these to animals and they would actually fall into a coma, alcohol-induced coma. Pretty cruel stuff. It stinks of the 80s there. But yeah, you can see that what I find interesting is the official reports state, oh, the troop trials were very positive, everybody liked the breads, it was preferred over the biscuits, and then you are confronted with this. And that makes me wonder what happened. Why do people not appreciate the bread so much when the reason it was adopted in the first place was that it was better than existing offers? That's something I don't quite understand, which leads me to believe that, I'm just speculating, there's probably very little instruction given to the men, and many people actually ate this in this soggy alcoholic form without actually leaving them out to dry. So
I mean, you're being offered alcohol.
exactly, yeah. So it probably was a welcome doping agent, so to speak, in certain tough times. But yeah, something tells me that maybe there was a misunderstanding from the troops. I mean, think about it. When you receive this, the first intuition is not just leave it out and let it dissipate. The intuition is eat it immediately.
So potentially a training and communication issue, which if it was dumped on the youngest, lower ranking troops, you could certainly see that happen. Like, you get this crap.
Or maybe there's even a bullying component to it where the information is being withheld deliberately so people can experience the nice taste of sterilized water and food-grade ethanol. But this I don't know. This is just speculation because the problem is we don't have one to taste. I would have loved to open a loaf, appreciate the smells and textures of it, and to actually, try it out with Mike and even the recipes potentially. So my ambition in the medium to long term is to, one, find the exact recipe, the exact concentration, the procedures, and hopefully be able to bake this at home. And even better, find an original loaf. Hopefully it's maybe a little bit beyond the shelf life, but
just a touch.
I would probably keep it in its plastic as a collector's piece, but just to see what it's like. And if any of you have a source to original Atombrot or have any written documentation on the exact recipe and process, please let us know because we would love to try it out live on this channel. I think that would be pretty neat.
That would be cool. That would be cool.
And luckily we're both older than 18, so legally we can't actually, because what's the alcohol? I think the alcohol concentration on this is 20%, so technically this is not for minors, unless you want to give this to children. Now, as a conclusion, unfortunately the Atombrot story ended in 1995 with the 1995 Army reform. Basically, the policies of decentralization, increased self-sufficiency they backtracked on that policy. And so there was no real purpose to continue the production of this poorly received bread. And probably what happened is that they were all just trashed. And that's a bit sad. Other than that, it was a pretty short presentation. This was done over a week of research, more or less, and I did the presentation this morning. So unfortunately, the quality level isn't what quite I want it to be, but I'm sure there's going to be more information that'll turn up on the long run. But you can see here the effort that goes into feeding an army. Because what is interesting is that we talk a lot about the weaponry, about the equipment, which is extremely important, I agree. But what I realized, what I forgot when studying very basically this topic was the bio-robots, so to speak, that operate these weapons have big squishy brains and muscles and tissues that require nourishment. So if your logistics are not solid, if your food is not solid, you cannot guarantee any semblance of effectiveness in terms of defending the country. And so I think there's much more to be studied on the topic of Swiss Army food.
And certainly from a sort of Anglo-American perspective, something that's very, very different to the way the Swiss do it is it's almost entirely based around centralized catering. There's no concept of an MRE or a 24-hour rat pack in the way there is in the British Army or the US Army. It's a bit more like the German Army in World War II. There's the concept of an iron ration. There's well, we've got tins of stuff there. You've got bag rations and things, but there's no. If you ask us to do a video on the current Swiss ration pack, simply there isn't one in that way. And then so you get into interesting topics like this, because we're talking about much more mass, much more centralized catering than Brits and Americans are used to.
I agree. And it being a small country as well helps a lot. And especially a small, well-developed country with well-established food industries, it's incredible.
Set up to fight defensively on their own territory.
Very important, yeah.
So,
that's about it on my side. It was a short and sweet presentation, and there's much more to be said. So thanks again for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to share all this.
Well, thank you so much. It's always great to be able to put your knowledge on my channel. Dale has his own channel, which is mostly republishing archive footage. I'll put a link to it in the description. So thank you very much for coming again. Thanks to our little flying friend who's been bugging us the whole time. Hope that wasn't
Needs a little bit of ethanol injected.
Thanks very much to patrons, as usual, who keep the channel chugging along. And if you want to become a patron, please consider doing so. Link at the end. And yeah, Dale, hope to have you back soon. He's got some files of mine that he's going to steal over there, which will be hopefully the topic of another video at some point.
Lots in store, lots in store. Stay tuned.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.